we're going to go ahead and get started with some initial opening remarks, and then we're going to dive into the presentation and then into a discussion. My name is Juan Carlos Garcia. I am the EV Policy and Equity Manager at the UC Davis Electric Vehicle Research Center. Today, I will be facilitating this webinar. If you are in the webinar that is focused on increasing electric vehicle adoption among priority populations, you are in the right place. And before we get started, we're going to kick it off with just a couple of housekeeping elements. This meeting is being recorded, and it will be posted later on the EV Research Center website, as well as the ITS Davis website. If you're having technical difficulties or if you have questions, please feel free to use the Q&A button, and somebody from our team will ensure that that is being responded to. Okay, so let's jump into today's discussion. In today's webinar, researchers from the UC Davis EV Research Center will present findings on and policy recommendations on a statewide survey that had asked participants and respondents about the transportation barriers and challenges in their communities. In full transparency, in my capacity as a staff researcher, I also contributed to this study. This research was unique for the EV Research Center as it aimed to focus specifically on the needs of communities that have been identified by the state as priority populations. More on that during the presentation. This research was also unique as it aimed to incorporate elements of community engaged research, and it aimed to center equity as a key piece of the research. The research teams took steps to ensure that equity was both part of the research process and an outcome of the research study itself. This included assembling a community advisory committee that provided expertise at various stages of the research. We also conducted community listening sessions in person and virtual, and we incorporated flexibility into the study to ensure that we were responsive to the expertise that was being shared by the advising body and by community residents. We hope that the presentation today and the discussion can shed some light on the challenges and barriers to EV adoption in priority populations across the state. Okay, at this point, I'm going to present our speakers for today. So first off, with the UC Davis research team, the co-principal investigator, Dr. Scott Hardman, is the associate research faculty and assistant director at the UC Davis Research Center, the UC Davis EV Research Center. Also from the UC Davis research team, we have Kelly Hoogland, who is a Ph.D. candidate at the UC Davis Electric Vehicle Research Center. Finally, we're joined by special guest, Maurissa Brown, who is the Transportation Equity Manager at the Greenlining Institute. In her role, Maurissa advocates for clean, safe, and affordable mobility options that benefit low-income communities of color. Maurissa works to ensure states' zero-emission vehicle transportation policy, planning, and investments build healthy, climate-resilient communities. Her and her Greenlining Transportation Equity team partook heavily in advocating for the passage of the Air Resources Board Advanced Clean Cars 2 and the Advanced Clean Fleet Regulations, representing their community partners, environmental justice, and health perspective. She engages with the Air Resources Board and the California Transportation Commission on equitable vehicle electrification. Maurissa will be our respondent, sharing insights and expertise from the perspective of an NGO. I should also mention that the Greenlining Institute has been a partner in this study, serving on the Community Advisory Committee and helping the team develop policy recommendations that will be shared in this presentation. All right, with that, I'm going to pass it over to my colleague, Dr. Scott Hardman and Kelly Hoogland, to present the research and the research findings.
Thanks, JC. Before I get going, just a screen look. Okay, you seeing the right view? Okay, perfect. Morning, everyone, or afternoon if you're further east than California. So yeah, I'm looking forward to sharing results from this project. This is a 2-year project that we've been working on with funding from the California Air Resources Board, and we've been working in collaboration with the Greenlining Institute, self-help enterprises based in the Central Valley, and also Transform. So I'll talk for about 15 minutes about some barriers we've identified to EV adoption within underserved communities, and then I'll hand over to Kelly, who will talk about some results from a survey experiment we designed to try and identify which policy levers can sort of increase EV adoption. Okay, just as a way of a little bit of background, I think we all know that at least in this early stage of the EV market introduction that we're in, the market is not so far been sort of equally distributed. We know that EV adoption is higher among higher income households and higher income areas. Higher income households also have more access to public chargers, more access to home charging and things like that. And I think it's important that we identify that as an issue. I think some of those features are potentially just something you would see with the introduction of any new technology, but we want to act now to make sure those don't become sort of like permanently entrenched issues. And we are, like, the state is dedicating funding, setting targets and so on to make sure that EV adoption is sort of more evenly distributed. And I think one thing we're trying to do in this project is to understand, okay, what are the barriers unique to underserved communities? What do people know about EVs? And also, how can we increase adoption in these communities? And when we say underserved communities or priority populations, what we're talking about is California Climate Investment's definition of priority populations, which includes disadvantaged communities identified using Calvin screen, tribal communities, low-income communities, and also low-income households living outside of these communities, but they in themselves are low-income. So that's kind of like the focus. All the data that we collected also comes from households and communities in these sort of designated priority groups. And the results today, they come from 2 data collection efforts. The first was some listening sessions. We did 7 sessions in the Central Valley and the Bay Area. We would have loved to do more in more areas, but they're quite hard to scale. So in addition to doing those listening sessions, to get sort of a picture of the statewide sort of status of EV adoption, awareness, engagement, and so on, we also conduct this survey. And both of those things look at people's travel behavior, their needs, their perceptions of electric vehicles, and also sort of explore which policy interventions could help increase EV adoption. Before I talk about electric vehicles, sort of as JC mentioned, we've been trying to do this sort of community engaged research. And I think, a key part of that is asking communities what they want, rather than just sort of assuming that they might want something. And so at every stage of the project, we've been asking people, okay, what do you see as a priority for yourself and your community? And this is just an example from the survey where we ask people to rate from lowest priority to highest priority several different sort of transportation investments. And you can see this is just showing the median response. This little black line here is the median response. You can see that on average, the highest sort of priority investment for this sample is investments in transit, followed by investments in improving walkability. And we found the same thing in the listening sessions as well. People reported they wanted like better crosswalks, better sidewalks, more lighting. They wanted more bus shelters, more bus routes, more frequent service, and so on. So I think it's important to acknowledge that. But I will also say that EVs here, they're like sort of the 4th highest priority. And so while that is not the #1 thing, it is still up there, and that's kind of going to be the focus of today. Okay, first onto some insights from the listening sessions. I think for us, the first thing that became clear was that just generally there was a relatively low level of knowledge with people participating in these sessions. So I have a quote here from a session we did in the Central Valley with a facilitator, which was JC in this case, just sort of said to people, what do you know about electric vehicles, without giving any sort of prior information? And people responded, I have no clue, I have not heard about that, I don't know anything at all. Someone said that they'd heard of them, but they didn't know anything. And then someone said, like, a Tesla, is that an electric vehicle? And so this really like kind of highlights the kind of conversation you can have with people, probably people outside of this webinar. Most people I speak to within the EV space, they do know a lot about electric vehicles. But I think this kind of highlights that there are a lot of people out there who are not as engaged in this transition as we are. However, and so after this kind of initial conversation on EVs, it wasn't very detailed. And so we show people like a 10-15 minute presentation just on the basics of EVs, cost, charging stuff, range, and so on. And that leads to like a more sort of detailed discussion. And I'll also say that I think people were surprisingly amenable to EVs, despite the fact that they didn't know much. They were very like interested in learning. And from that same session, from those 4 quotes, where actually no one had heard about EVs prior to that session, at the end of the session, 2 people sort of said like, "Oh, actually, like this is interesting to me. Like you've sparked a flame in my head. Like I want to go off and do some research." So that engagement did sort of help people learn more about it and seriously consider buying one. That being said, though, there are still barriers to adoption, and these are the sort of the most common barriers that we detected through analyzing these sort of the results from these sessions. And I've ordered it in the order in which they appeared and were spoken about negatively. So we kind of through these analysis of these transcripts, and the most commonly spoke about negative perception was a lack of public charging infrastructure. That was followed by a lack of home charging infrastructure, often in apartment buildings, or people living in apartment buildings, often people living in rented homes, but also people living in single family homes, which I think is important to remember. Next was vehicle cost. People perceived both new and used EVs to be expensive. People also had concerns about batteries, battery reliability, degradation. They had concerns about maintaining an electric vehicle, often specific to a used electric vehicle. And then finally, there was a perception that there weren't substantial benefits of buying an EV compared to a gas car. And I think like, remember this is California. So this may be a California specific thing, but this was mostly driven by high electricity costs, such that people didn't really see that if they were to buy an EV, they would get, fuel cost savings. Okay, now onto the survey. So, that's the insights from the sessions in a small number of communities. Wanted to get a picture of how does this look throughout the state. And we're going to use the survey for that to talk about the same issues. So first, knowledge and consideration to buy an EV. So the figure on the left shows results of a question where we ask people in the survey, can you name a battery electric vehicle or a plug-in hybrid electric vehicle that is, that exists? And we kind of use this in a lot of studies as a proxy for people's knowledge of EVs. So if someone can name an EV, they're more knowledgeable than someone who can't. And people can answer this question, yes, no, or I don't know. And if they say yes, we ask them to fill out in their little text box the make and model of a vehicle. We go through those and we score those. And the purple bar here is our respondents who are correct. So in this sample, 43%, less than half, could correctly name the make and model of an electric vehicle. Another 11% were correct, but could only name a make. So that's putting things like Tesla, I don't know, or Tesla, I'm not sure, primarily, and some instances of like Rivian, I don't know. But for the most part, most people do not have a high level of knowledge. And on the right, we also ask people if they've previously thought about buying an electric vehicle. This figure is focusing on battery electric vehicles. We also ask about plug-in hybrids. The results are quite similar. But on the whole, half have never thought about buying an electric vehicle in any way. And then another 26% the idea has occurred, but they haven't really done anything about it. And so those two groups combined means about 80% of this population have never really thought about buying an EV in any meaningful way. 11% have started to gather some information, but they hadn't really gotten serious about buying one yet. 4% have actively shopped for a battery electric vehicle, but they hadn't made a decision yet. And then 7% of households own one or have owned one. Now, I want to focus on these two groups here. These two groups who have thought about buying an electric vehicle in some way, we also ask them if they've made a decision. And they can say, I decided to buy one, but haven't yet. I decided against buying one, or I'm undecided. Most people were undecided, but those people who decided to not buy an electric vehicle, we're going to focus on why that was as a indication of barriers to EV adoption. Of course, we can look at like perceptions of EVs across this entire sample, and we do ask everyone about how they perceive range and charging and so on. But the thing to remember is most people are not engaged about EVs. When they take a survey about EVs, they're probably forming perceptions of EVs within the survey for the first time. So those are kind of like pretty abstract ideas about barriers, whereas these groups have come across some barrier that has prevented them from buying an EV. And so just for this presentation, we want to focus on why that is. And this is just showing a count of the most commonly reported reasons for not buying an EV. And again, it's similar to the results from the listening sessions. The most commonly reported reason why someone didn't buy an EV is a lack of home charging. Some of that is access to public charging. Some of that is access to home charging. Some people didn't specify. If I were to read between the lines, I would say most of it was home charging, but they didn't say like at home. They would just say like, I didn't have any place to plug it in. But I think a lot of that was at home. Next was similar again to the listening sessions, purchase cost. Something that didn't emerge in the listening sessions was a concern about driving range, but here we do see that as a reason for not buying an EV. And then some lesser reported reasons are things like the availability of a vehicle, like you went to buy one, but you couldn't find one, the cost to install a charger at home, concerns about batteries, which again, we saw in the listening sessions, and some other reasons. And so I think these are important because like, these are reasons people don't buy an EV after wanting to buy one. So it's like a real experienced barrier rather than some like perceived like abstract idea from the rest of the population. And I think really we want to be trying to figure out how to get rid of all of those reasons to not buy an EV. Okay, and then the final group of barriers I'll talk about before I hand over to Kelly is what we're calling a misalignment of programs with needs and behavior. And so this is kind of where we're looking at, the way people typically behave and the design of programs and sort of seeing a mismatch. So the first thing I'll say is state and federal used electric vehicle incentives. They only apply to people if they buy an electric vehicle from a dealer. However, in this sample of priority populations, 37% of them do not buy a car from a dealer. So immediately that's concerning. A large number of households are not eligible for any incentives. And then it's a little bit more concerning when you look at the average household income of people based on where they buy their vehicles. And so people who buy from a private owner here have the lowest household income of any used car buyers. And so the people who perhaps need the most support are actually getting no support at all from state or federal incentives. That's one example. A second example I'll talk about relates to like warranties. So within the Advanced Clean Cars 2 regulation or the ZEV regulation, there's a warranty requirement that electric vehicles have a battery warranty for 100,000 miles or 8 years. However, 40% of households, typically they buy cars that are older than 8 years or have more than 100,000 miles. So that's what this figure shows. It's when someone buys a used vehicle, how many years can they own it before they get to that 8-year point or that 100,000 mile point? And 40% immediately are buying a car that is beyond that point. And then another 15% or so, they only have 3 years of warranty. And again, if you look at the income of these households, they are lower income. So it's sort of a case that the lowest income households are taking potentially a higher risk than other people. And then one other thing related to vehicle age is the federal used EV tax credit only applies when the vehicle is sold for like used as the first time. A lot of these older vehicles have had more than 2 owners or more than 1 owner. And so people, again, won't be eligible for that credit. There are more examples we can talk about in the Q&A. Okay, so just to summarize, before I hand over to Kelly, yeah, most people are not thinking about buying EVs. We all probably are thinking about EVs a lot, but I think the majority of people in these communities aren't. And then barriers to adoption that we identified are low knowledge. I think that, to me, is the biggest, most substantial barrier to EV adoption currently, as well as a lack of home and public infrastructure, high vehicle costs, and concerns about battery reliability. Those 4 barriers Kelly's going to focus on in a second. And then we also have things like range, a perceived lack of benefits of adopting an EV, and as well as this sort of misalignment with policies, with people's needs and how they typically behave. So with that, I will hand over to Kelly.
Great. Yeah, thank you everyone for joining. I'm going to be discussing the survey experiment and the key findings relevant to informing policy. So as Scott mentioned, the listening sessions brought about several key barriers to consumer adoption of BEVs, and BEVs will be the focus of this experiment. The goal of the experiment was to test whether or not existing existing policies which align with these barriers are in fact increasing consumers' consideration to purchase a BEV. So firstly, for high purchase price, we test several levels of financial incentives. For lack of charging, we test several levels of charging access. And for battery concerns, we test various battery assurance measures. And so respondents were randomly shown one of 54 scenarios, which consisted of a various combination of these policy interventions. And then after which they were asked their likelihood of considering buying a BEV. So before I get into more detail into the various interventions, some of the benefits of the survey design include low fatigue effects, since each respondent was only shown one scenario. And additionally, compared to direct questioning, there's also reduced social desirability bias. And lastly, as you'll see, we also try to accommodate for low baseline knowledge of BEVs in order to hopefully get accurate responses from consumers who may be far away from the actual purchase decision of BEVs. So firstly, for financial incentives, we are, this is based off of the Clean Cars for All incentive, where we're comparing the presence of information on this incentive to no information. And you can see in the text, the text that respondents would have seen when taking this survey. And additionally, we also provide information on a 1/3 reduced version of this incentive, with the idea being that with the current budget deficit of California and sort of limited funding for incentives for low-income buyers, perhaps a lower incentive could reach a larger base of low-income buyers. And this incentive, the Clean Cars for All, is going to be expanded into a statewide program administered by the Community Housing Development Corporation and also the Air Resources Board. And this will hopefully be able to reach more consumers as well. Next, for charging, we're comparing the presence of information on public level 2 charging to information on other charging types and locations. And so again, you can see in the text what respondents would have seen when taking this survey. And we keep the cost just relative to that of fueling a gas car. And then we also provide 2 time windows for that of public level 2 and public fast. Then additionally, we have home charging and destination/work charging. And then lastly, some combinations of home and destination, and also home and public fast. And lastly, for battery assurance measures, we are comparing information on a rebate for battery replacement. And this is based off of the ZEV assurance program from the Air Resources Board, which is currently in development still. And then additionally, we have information on BEV warranties based off of the Advanced Clean Cars 2 ruling. And so to put it all together, here we have the survey experiment as respondents would have seen, and an example scenario. So at the top, we have an introduction, again, to provide respondents with necessary information. And here we hold constant a few BEV attributes, including the range, whether it's new or used, we don't specify, as well as availability of model types. In the middle, you can see a possible scenario. And for this example, this respondent was shown information on each of the 3 interventions, but this, of course, would not be the case for all respondents. And then lastly, at the bottom, we have the likelihood to consider buying a BEV. And this is on a continuous 700-point scale from very unlikely to very likely. And so in addition to the policy interventions, we use a linear regression model to control for other categories of variables, to control for other variables that we know are related to BEV adoption. And these include demographics, BEV-related perceptions related to charging and range, battery quality, self-knowledge and awareness, and home chargeability. And lastly, a contextual variable and some general attitudinal variables. And so I will jump straight into the results for the policy interventions. And we changed the scale of the dependent variable from 100 to 700 into a 0 to 100 point scale. So this way we can interpret the results as the % change in likelihood of considering buying a BEV given the presence of each of the interventions. So over on the left, we have the financial incentives. And compared to no information, the reduced version of the Clean Cars for All is statistically significant at about the 10% level, whereas the full Clean Cars for All is statistically significant and increases consideration by about 5 percentage points. Also, to note, we did want to test to see if there were differences between income groups for this incentive, but we did not find any differences between income groups. In the middle, we have the results for charging, where the reference group is public level 2. And we didn't find any statistically significant differences between public level 2 and fast charging. Whereas all of the other 4 locations we did find to be statistically significant, with access to just home charging by itself having the largest effect. And lastly, for battery assurance measures, we did not find any statistically significant effects compared to no information for either of these interventions. And we also were particularly interested to see if there were any effects for used car buyers in particular compared to new. And we also did not find any effects there. And so, as I mentioned, we also control for some other variables, and we found some statistically significant results. Related to income, we found that compared to households earning $50,000 or less, higher income households are more likely to consider buying a BEV in addition to new car buyers. Secondly, positive perceptions were also influencing purchase consideration. In particular, positive perceptions of battery quality, in addition to charging access and range, and also home chargeability. Then we did find some attitudes that kind of align with current literature in regards to pro-environmental attitudes, and also pro-mixed land use, so sort of more urban attitudes. And also, lastly, we found people who do not find waiting to be a waste of time are also more likely to consider buying a BEV. And then lastly, our contextual variable was significant. So more census tracts with more EVs, the respondents living there are more likely to consider buying a BEV. And so now I'll just give a summary of the key findings. So firstly, financial incentives, and in particular, the Clean Cars for All, does have a positive effect on consideration. And the effect of the Clean Cars for All is actually fairly comparable to the effect of a household earning $100,000 more in income. And secondly, regarding charging, we find that access to charging at home has the greatest effect on purchase consideration relative to other locations. And lastly, we did not find warranties and battery rebates to be really an effective lever in increasing consideration. And I do think it's important to note that overall, just controlling for the policy interventions by themselves accounts for just a small amount of the variation in BEV purchase consideration. And so, yeah, we importantly do find consideration is also related to demographics and having positive perceptions of BEVs, and also some attitudinal variables. So yeah, now I'll pass it back to Scott to sort of put all of these findings together and how they inform policy.
Thanks, Kelly. Yeah, so I'll just wrap up quickly, kind of summarizing everything Kelly and I have spoken about, and then I'll hand over to Maurissa. So, and these are actually quite broad. We did originally have quite detailed policy implications, but it took a while to get through. I think like we're happy to talk more about like these kind of high-level ideas. I think like firstly, as Kelly showed, incentives do have a positive effect. Cost is a barrier, so we should be providing those, but at the same time, we should also be making sure people are aware of those. So in addition to investing in the incentive itself, also investing in programs to help people understand that they are available to them, and also making sure we align those programs with how people behave, so they don't have to make like multiple behavior changes when they're already making this shift to an EV. I think the second thing we see is, we should continue to think about home and work or destination charging as the foundational location of EV charging. I think we've known this for a long time. We know that home charging it's the most influential in the decision to buy an EV. It's the most frequently used, most convenient, cheapest place to charge. It's also correlated with the decisions to continue ownership. Whereas, just public fast charging in its own doesn't increase consideration. It's expensive, potentially more so than driving a gas car. And it's also less convenient. Obviously, we need that, but we should continue to think about that as being supplemental to home charging or charging at some regular sort of destination. And I guess when I say home, I mean wherever people park their car while they're at home. It doesn't have to be on a driveway or a parking lot. It could be on the street, some public land, and so on. And then the final thing, we don't see an effect of these warranties on people's consideration, potentially because it doesn't help that many people. So originally within the ZEV regulation, there was this idea to have a 150,000 mile and 10-year warranty. I think having that would support more people and have fewer people in sort of a risky situation. And in absence of that, I think these battery rebates, even though we don't find them to be influential in people's decision to buy an EV, they may be important to help reduce any burden that people might have if they do experience a battery failure. Okay, final three things. Kind of more broadly, I think it's important to engage with communities and ask them what they want and what they need, and also and align programs with their needs and wants. And we've kind of been a little general in this webinar, kind of talking about communities in the same way, but there are a lot of differences. Communities will need different types of support, and so it's possible to do that through these listening sessions, surveys, and so on. We can determine which communities need which support by asking them, as well as greater levels of engagement. And I think the final thing I want to talk about is, so this on the right is something called the innovation decision process. It's kind of a theoretical framework of how someone goes about buying a new technology. And the first stage of that is awareness and knowledge, learning about a technology. Then you began to think about it, decide if you will buy one or not. You then make your decision and then work on implementing it. And I think we do a lot. We spend a lot of time and effort and money on these three stages here, through like billions of dollars in infrastructure investments, billions of dollars of incentives, but we actually do very little on this first stage. And like I shaped it like a funnel because it is kind of a funnel. The more people you put in the top, the more people you will have ultimately buying an EV. And we do very little using public dollars on engaging people and making them aware of EVs. And that is the baseline. That is how people start this process. And I think it's especially important in communities, underserved communities that have lower rates of adoption at the moment, because a lot of people may not have someone they can talk to learn about an EV, whereas a lot of higher income communities, higher income households, they know other people they can talk to, friends, colleagues, neighbors, about EVs and learn about them. Whereas in these communities, they may not have that. And so I think investing in that first stage of the process can be quite influential and should be a focus. Okay, so just to wrap up these sort of questions that we had at the beginning, awareness and knowledge is low. I think we need to, continually remind ourselves that we are very engaged, but a lot of people are not. However, I would say most people seemed open to the idea of a ZEV. That being said, there are real barriers, and I think, whether or not those barriers are addressed will largely depend on what we do and ideas that we come up with to sort of come over those barriers. And I think the final thing I'll say is communities did report electric vehicle investments as a quite high priority, but higher than that was investments into transit and walkability. So I think, ZEVs can solve some problems, but obviously not all of them. Yeah, and I think just thanks to the Air Resources Board, thanks to the partners, and thanks a lot to, there's been a lot of people working on this project, so I just want to acknowledge all their support that they gave us, and it was really great sort of collaborating. And we'll have a Q&A after Maurissa talks, but Kelly and I are also happy to meet and chat about any of these ideas at a later time. So with that, JC,
Yeah, let's hand it off to, I see a few questions, but let's hold off after Maurissa's presentation, and then we can tackle some of these questions. So Maurissa, the floor is yours.
Great. Hi, folks. Thank you so much for joining us this morning. My Zoom's been a little bit finicky, so please let the moderators know if for any reason you cannot hear me or the audio goes out. So I'll start my response to the studies by giving a bit more context to the transportation landscape for priority populations. If you're not familiar, Greenlining is a research and public policy nonprofit that has been advocating for racial equity and economic justice for 30 years. We are fighting to pass policy solutions and implement practices to build a future where communities of color can build wealth, live in healthy places filled with economic opportunity, and will be ready to meet the challenges posed by climate change. And so why is this racial equity work necessary? This slide has 3 maps, all of Oakland, where I'm currently based. So the first is the 1937 redlining map, where communities of color were segregated and denied investment. The middle is a 2018 map of communities who suffer most from poverty and pollution. And then the last map of 2021 shows communities with the most number of COVID cases. So clearly there is a thread of connection between these maps. These disproportionate impacts are a result of how our legacy of racial disparities continues to be embedded into our structural and institutional policies. While this map is of Oakland, many different cities across California and across the United States were intentionally redlined. And this legacy lives on today when we start to try to understand the barriers to transportation access and why EVs have been adopted at lower rates in some communities versus others. There are very deep-rooted socio-political factors that make EVs less of a priority for disadvantaged communities. This is in part why Greenlining does our work. We do this through the practice of greenlining, which we define as the affirmative and proactive practices of providing economic opportunity to communities of color. And we do this across a number of policy areas, including transportation and mobility, as well as clean energy and building decarbonization and climate adaptation and resilience. So over the years, Greenlining has been very involved in the development and implementation of California's clean mobility policies and programs, including ZEVs. We now have more equity-centered programs that range from financial incentives for electric vehicles, diesel school bus replacement, electric vehicle car sharing, community-driven clean mobility pilots, and many more. But Greenlining wanted to understand more about how these programs are addressing equity in a comprehensive way for populations who need these clean mobility services the most. This evaluation that we did can be found in our Clean Mobility Equity Playbook, which we published in 2021, so a few years ago. And the purpose of this playbook is to serve as a guide for California, other states, and the federal government around how to be more intentional about how we invest our funds, how to improve existing equity clean mobility programs and how to determine which mobility strategies we should replicate, reform, or retire. We evaluated clean mobility programs based on Greenlining's 6 standards for equitable investment and Greenlining's Making Equity Real framework. This framework seeks to uncover how equity shows up across a program's mission, the process of how it was developed and implemented, its outcomes, and its measurement and analysis. So the combination of the 6 standards and the Making Equity Real framework is how we conducted an equity evaluation of existing clean mobility programs at the time. Together, these 2 methodologies give us a full scope understanding of what is working, what are the equity gaps, how to address them, and through this evaluation, we were able to derive some best practices for programs featured in this clean mobility playbook. And I walked through this because the evaluation helped us identify these 3 overarching high-level recommendations that the research at UC Davis on increasing ZEV access for priority populations really supports. So first, fund and scale programs that comprehensively approach mobility equity and are led by communities. If you want a program that solves transportation problems for a specific group of people, those solutions must be driven by those people, which the UC Davis study utilized people listening sessions and surveys to help understand priority populations' needs. So the UC Davis study will help implementers understand which EV program investments will be helpful and which won't. The research also recommends that California needs to invest in building community capacity, such that communities have the resources themselves to deliver mobility and ZEV-related improvements for their neighborhood or community. Meaning, in order for these ZEV investments to move towards equity, California needs to fund and scale people power and capacity such that folks can liberate themselves. Second, target funding to the people with the most barriers to maximize available resources. So as we all know, or at least most of us will know, California is in a current budget deficit. So we need targeted funding on a need basis for priority populations to make sure we are reaching them. The UC Davis research showed that large purchase incentives significantly increased likelihood for priority population households to consider a battery electric vehicle. And California does have programs like the Clean Cars for All, which provides incentives to help lower income consumers living in a priority area to replace their old, higher polluting vehicles with newer and cleaner transportation. However, the Greenlining Institute and Union of Concerned Scientists have found in a report we published recently that there are still gaps in getting incentives into lower income households that drive pre-2004 vehicles, which are more likely to be high polluting cars. There was also previously the Clean Vehicle Rebate Project that has run for many years. However, recent research by the UCLA Luskin Center also showed that this project was ineffective at getting funds to lower income disadvantaged communities. So California has a lot more work to do around targeting funding. Lastly, slowly phase out programs that continue to entrench our dependency on single passenger vehicles. So California has funneled billions of dollars into the programs that either subsidize single passenger vehicle purchases or encourage single passenger vehicle use, like programs that fund general lane highway widening in urban areas. Yet we know that this is not sufficient to solve the climate crisis in the long term, and as well as the human crisis surrounding critical mineral mining. So the UC Davis research showed and unearthed that transportation investment priorities, with transit investment being the highest priority. Those most in need are telling us that investing in transit, walkability, bikeability, and just other clean mobility options that reduce car dependence is really important. And while vehicle electrification is of importance, given that we are in a budget shortfall, California really needs to see investments and policies that in the long term reduce congestion and unsustainable land use patterns. I will say that our Clean Mobility Playbook was written a few years ago, so CARB has updated their scope of programs. And also just like as an added point here, that while some regions are indeed just inherently more car dependent, in these areas, state and federal funds should fund programs that reduce the need for costly car ownership, such as various car share programs. And so lastly, for greenlining, we want to think about our policy levers. How are we taking our lessons learned from research and applying it to state legislation? And so I want to share two pieces of legislation that Greenlining co-sponsored in this 2023-2024 cycle. And these were AB 2401 and AB 2535. So AB 2401 was sponsored by Ting, and it was about expanding and updating clean cars for all, which is also a theme that came up in the UC Davis study, in order to increase the likelihood of battery electrification vehicle purchase. So for this bill, Greenlining was aiming to update the program to increase ZEV incentives for low-income, high-mileage drivers with older, high-polluting vehicles. We also wanted to require the collection of vehicle data to allow for targeted outreach, right? Because if we need transparency of data to do that targeted outreach by program administrators to the lowest income individuals who bear the highest transportation costs from older, high-use vehicles and are most exposed to harmful air pollution in their communities. And then lastly, for this bill, we wanted to move the program to a need-based approach to be more targeted, to ensure critical funding is being prioritized for the most driven, most polluting vehicles on the road. And this will help the state meet its climate goals while making clean transportation more affordable for low-income Californians. And then secondly, for AB 25, which was sponsored by Bonta, so while the UC Davis study wasn't specific to medium and heavy-duty vehicles, this is a problem area that is of importance to greenlining in terms of electrifying freight that is a large diesel polluter in disadvantaged communities and addressing the problematic, unsustainable nature of widening highways in urban areas as it obstructs the planning of transit and walkability and biking. So with this bill, we aim to eliminate new general purpose highway lanes as an eligible use of the Trade Corridor Enhancement Program funding, and then limit highway expansion in the most pollution burdened communities and ensure that at least 50% of this TSEP funding, so TSEP gets millions of dollars, is used to build out zero emission freight infrastructure. So here's my contact info. I'm very happy to follow up with any questions that you would like to message me, and I'll just pass it back to JC.
Excellent. Thank you, Maurissa. Thank you for that awesome presentation. Thank you to the researchers. I think this is the point where we want to shift gears and dive into some of the questions that have been filling up in the Q&A. There's a few specific questions or clarifying questions with regards to the research. And so I'm gonna start with those. Scott and Kelly, it looks like there's a question here on slide 8 with regards to the order of how these were outlined, the specific barriers. So the question is from Maya Wolf. I'm struck that the public charging access is listed before home access. Looks like Maya is here from PG&E.
Yeah, that is not necessarily like an ordered list of how important or how much of a barrier these are. It's just I just ordered them in how much they were spoken about negatively by people. And so it's just the case that people spoke more more negatively about public access. And really, like, I don't think we should read too much into that because it's like a qualitative study. And it could also be influenced by what we kind of the information we showed them. So like we showed them a map of like public charging access in their community, for example. And so that could have led to more discussion about that. But in other areas of the study and the survey and so on, we do see like home charging as being sort of more influential in people's decisions.
I'd like to add that in particular, like my own prior research has shown people don't necessarily have accurate perceptions of their public charge access because they're just simply not aware of it. And I think that was shown in even one of the quotes. It's not necessarily that the public charging doesn't exist. They just say they haven't ever seen it, which I think aligns with overall low knowledge of BEVs because they may not, know the signs or have a reason to look for charging and therefore, yeah.
You're actually teeing up my next policy webinar, the next EV policy webinar. It's going to be focused on the public infrastructure system, public charging infrastructure network. So more details on that at the end of this session here. Maybe another question. This is pertaining to the assistance, specifically those state programs that provide assistance. This is a question from Amir. And the question is, when you say that people with the lowest incomes don't receive the assistance, doesn't the subsidy also reduce the market price for used vehicles sold by private owners? There may be some clarification needed for that, but anybody want to take that?
I think like the idea is that if you reduce the price of something new or the first time it's sold used, that could lead to the next time it's sold used also being a reduced price. I think like theoretically that could be the case. I haven't seen evidence for that. And I would say like probably the market would need to be more like in a state of equilibrium for that to be the case. And if the market is sort of constrained by supply rather than demand, maybe people are, that wouldn't necessarily be the case because there's more people who want to buy that used vehicle than there are available used vehicles to purchase.
I see. Thank you for that, Scott. I see more questions coming in, but I want to kind of circle back before I reach out into the Q&A box, reach back out to Maurissa with regards to what is the role that organizations like Greenlining, NGOs and nonprofits groups, what do you foresee the role to be or continue to be in this transition towards electrification in the transportation sector, specifically for these priority communities?
Right. Thank you for that question. I think the role for NGOs and nonprofits in this transition to electrification will be one, advocacy surrounding creating these programs and implementing these programs, because implementation is really what makes or breaks a program. And then holding agencies accountable, agencies and other stakeholders as well, because it's not just state agencies that impact access, but holding agencies and other stakeholders accountable around equitable access. Advocates can work through legislation, or they can work through program guideline development. So all of these state programs have guidelines that are attached to them. And so agencies have a schedule in which they will go through and update those guidelines. And so advocates can plug in there to engage directly with program administrators to update those guidelines and get information in those guidelines that will help increase access to priority populations. And then secondly, I will say that NGOs and nonprofits can continue to do the on the ground involvement work directly with community-based organizations or grassroots organizations that have direct connections with priority populations, and just helping to build out capacity. I mentioned that as well. It's like people need the capacity to then liberate themselves, and we can help provide these communities decision-making power in order to increase access to clean mobility options and allow them to formulate solutions for themselves and their own communities.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you for that. And want to reiterate a point I made early on in the session with regards to the research and really making an effort in this project to ensure that equity was a key part and center to the research plan, not only as a process, making sure that we had those touch points with our community advisory committee, making sure that we reached out to community residents in those listening sessions. And so these elements really were baked into the process, but also wanting to ensure that those outcomes of this research were equitable as well. So there's a few more questions here. I think we did ask a question in the survey with regards to car sharing, and there is a question here in the Q&A, and this is for the group. Do you think having access to shared EVs could be a good option for some of these communities? So this community car share model or this model of car sharing, would that be something that would provide an avenue to adoption of EVs, or what can we see or can we expect from communities if these programs were available?
I'm no expert on car sharing programs, but my one thought would be kind of just similar to what Maurissa has emphasized about like on the ground support. I feel like that would be very necessary for a car sharing program like that. I think, yeah, the one that I know of, Mio Car in California, that pilot program, I'm sure it's successful because of, you know, all of the education and awareness campaigns that go along with it, to really get people to use the program and to see the benefits of it in the first place. Yeah.
Yes, and just to support that thought, Kelly, I definitely think that's a good place to start. Of course, you need to engage with the community to see if that is workable for the community, but I also think that it's a good solution for folks who are living more rurally so that they don't have to go through the process of costly car ownership. I know that there has been our community car share pilot project. There has been the agricultural workers van pool project. So I think I definitely support the idea of car share. And I think it's a great way for increasing just general knowledge and interaction with an electric vehicle.
Yeah, thank you both. In this last remark, Maurissa, you brought up something important and interesting, that there's these regions and contexts across the state. You have the urban environment where there may be more opportunities to have mobility, whereas in an urban environment that completely changes. And so those folks in those rural environments may be a bit more dependent on vehicles. And so programs like this could provide that opportunity without the burden of a vehicle ownership. And so I think thinking about strategies and solutions tailored to the specific and unique needs of those communities is key and essential as we move into this transition. So thank you for bringing that up. There is another question here with regards to awareness efforts, and which one may have resonated most with communities. So it's from Kristen Gomez. Were you able to identify what awareness efforts would resonate most with this community? Is it placing EVs in these communities or community educational sessions, etc.? Thank you for your work.
That's a really good question. And there's also a question below, which is kind of related to that. So maybe I'll answer them both. I kind of see that as well as a research question. I don't quite know like what the best like way to engage with these communities is. Like, what information should we give to them? How do we even get people to pay attention to this information? A lot of people are not thinking about EVs, so even if we put information out there, they may not necessarily sort of pay attention. So I don't have a really good answer to that. I would love to see a study that tests or examines like which programs are the most effective. Because I feel like I keep saying, or we keep saying, we need to do more in education, more in engagement, more in outreach, but I don't have the information to yet say like specifically what that information should be and how that outreach should look. So I think I would love to be able to like get more insight in that through some research. And then the second question that's related to this is what % of the budget should go towards capital investments versus EV and education outreach efforts? I don't have a good answer, but like if you look at the investments for infrastructure or incentives, that's billions of dollars. Like NEVI is $5 billion, the National Electric Vehicle Infrastructure Program. The CEC most recent funding plan for infrastructure is $2 billion. Just this year, we've allocated over $1 billion in federal incentives for EVs. You can quite quickly get over $10 billion looking at infrastructure and incentive investments. But like, I would be extremely surprised if we've spent even 1/10 of that on education outreach efforts. So I don't know what the number is, but it's definitely like, it should be more than what is being spent. And there's like benefits to that too. There's also research that shows if people are aware of infrastructure, if people are aware of incentives, those efforts become more effective. And so you also increase the effectiveness of investments you're already making by spending more on outreach, education, and engagement work. Yeah, I don't know if Kelly or JC or Maurissa has anything to add.
Yeah, I can add to the first part of the question about like what's the best way to do outreach. And so just in my work, I've found that finding a community champion. So I guarantee there is someone in the neighborhood or the community, whether it's like a student advocate group, church leaders, or directly a transportation group, already doing the work or just relevant work surrounding environmental justice. So if you find a community champion who is willing to hear your message and take your message directly to the folks living there, I think that's a great place to start.
Yeah, I like that point because I think network effects are, really influential and sort of in Scott's presentation, as you mentioned, higher income people sort of have that built in. Whereas, yeah, in these communities, I think a trusted source of information is key. And I think in general, a lot of like government campaigns across other interventions overall have like low awareness, unfortunately. But yeah, I think I'm also curious in investigating, what types of information people are most receptive to. Yeah, but unknown right now. Yeah, I think.
And maybe just to add a final point, and maybe a bit more context around the community listening sessions. These were conducted both virtual and in person. For those in persons, specifically the one that we did in Hoogland and in Visalia, very different contexts, one rural, one urban. We actually partnered with a community organization that was within that geographic area that had positive rapport with that community, and essentially went to this space of comfort for that community to provide and to one, hear the lived experiences that they had to share, but also to provide a little bit more understanding about this technology. And so in that way, we found it valuable to sort of co-create these spaces with that person in that community, that organization in that community that has that positive report in that platform. And we're really thankful that they provided us and shared that space with us for us to have that those listening sessions that were instrumental in how we shaped the questionnaire itself. So I will shift gears here to another question. This question is coming from Giovanni Hernandez, which is for Scott. Scott alluded to incentive programs that are not helping those that need the help the most to adopt EVs. Can you elaborate more on this? Is this conclusion including folks living in disadvantaged communities that don't qualify for incentives? but aren't necessarily high income?
Yeah, so the kind of specific attribute of the programs I mentioned in this was the fact you have to buy an EV from a dealer, and a lot of people don't buy a car from a dealer. So, while that's a lot of people who potentially need an incentive that can't get it just because of some program design attribute or decision. The second bit about people who aren't necessarily high income not qualifying, I think that is a current concern we have. So the Clean Cars for All program used to apply for households who are up to 400% of the federal poverty line, which is a calculation based on the number of people in the household and the number of and the household income. And they recently reduced that from 400% of the federal poverty line to 300%. And we actually evaluated that program, and we also looked at that in this study, and we do see that these households now that are between 300% of the federal poverty line and 400%, they are equally as dependent on incentives in buying an EV as people below 300%, both in our evaluation of state programs and in when Kelly looked at the survey experiment. So I think that was a budget decision, and that's one reason we wanted to look at an incentive that had a 1/3 reduced value, because you could theoretically use the same amount of money to give a slightly smaller incentive to a larger group of people, and that is kind of like a difficult decision to make, I think, because then you give some people less money, and lower income people would get less money. Slightly higher income people, although they are still low income, would get money, whereas now they don't. I think, yeah, I think it would make more sense if the program used the prior eligibility criteria of 300 to 400%, because I don't see any evidence that that decision was necessarily supported by any data, including in the program evaluation data that the program administrators have. So I think, but it's a budget question. So how do we make that? How do we get that funding available? I think Maurissa alluded to this. A lot of these programs are just funded through allocations of funding that eventually run out. A lot of programs do not have sort of continual funding. The Clean Vehicle Rebate, Clean Vehicle Assistance Program, Clean Cars for all of these programs at some point have had lengthy gaps in funding. And so I think we really have to find ways of how do we fund programs continually so people know that they're getting an incentive, and fund them sufficiently that enough people can get that money. And I think that's like kind of an answer that we don't have. A lot of people like the idea of like a fee-based design where you charge a little bit more money to people buying polluting cars and give that money back to people buying efficient cars. But yeah, so I think we have to do better at funding these programs.
Getting a little bit of a shout out here in the Q&A, Scott. Maya from PG&E is letting us know that pre-owned EV rebate do not require the EV to be purchased from a dealership. We would love to see more programs like it out there. There's also a comment here saying that there are a growing number of licensed online dealerships that are facilitating person-to-person sales and are successfully applying the federal incentive program. So thank you for folks.
Yeah, and that's all great. Like the more people that can get those incentives, the better. Definitely.
Awesome. There's a question here, sort of along the same lines with regards to challenges and the differences in needs between households. This question is from Lauren McDonald. One of the narratives around EVs for several years is that they are only for wealthy upper income households. Is there any research around lower income populations rejecting EVs almost as a way of rejecting / protesting the lifestyle of higher income populations?
We didn't, I mean, I think like we didn't ask about that in the survey, so we couldn't say anything about that, but people did not talk about that in the listening sessions. We did not hear people saying that like, oh, I don't want an EV. We didn't detect that in the qualitative aspect of this study.
Yeah, in my research work and my engagement work with grassroots and community-based organizations, I have not heard that narrative. It's rather that people, like the populations, and it also depends on how we are defining priority populations. But for greenlining, these populations are the ones that are surrounded by busy roadways, freeways, ports, other freight corridors. So they're being inundated by toxic pollution. They have these historical, socio-political issues surrounding the legacy of redlining. So there's just so many other factors that these lower income folks and communities of color are dealing with before they're getting to the thought of like, I'm going to go spend thousands of dollars on an electric vehicle. So it's really more of just like having to deal with the issues of history and day-to-day life that don't fall in line with like having to go think about purchasing a vehicle, or at least a new electric vehicle. That's the narrative that I have engaged with in my research.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And I would just to add a point that I think the barriers go beyond just high purchase price, sort of just, agreeing with what Maurissa was saying there. There's other things in the way.
Thank you for that. There's a follow-up question also from Lauren McDonald. The research supports what I believe is perhaps the biggest challenge to priority populations, which is that we won't have a significant volume of affordable used EVs available for perhaps another 6 to 10 years. This seems to support that for the rest of this decade, that focused on bikes, mass transit, car sharing, etc., will have a bigger impact. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I guess like I think I agree with the first point, like the whether or not adoption of used EVs is high depends on the supply of new vehicles. And that like should be, we should continue to support new vehicle market growth through like the ZEV regulation, through incentives and so on. And at some point those vehicles will enter the used vehicle market, used vehicle buyers will buy them and so on. Yeah, but that, that will take time. Like that is a process that will take time. So we do have to be focused. And yeah, I mean, I agree with the last point. Like the communities we engaged with, they also agree with the statement that like bikes and transit and walkability, those are things that these households want to see investments into. And yeah, that could have a more immediate impact.
And I'll just add to this question is something that Scott just brought up is the need for a sustainable source of funding. The budget deficits that California is experiencing and will continue to experience is unfortunately making our government make hard choices and pitting programs against one another. So like, for example, I talked about single passenger vehicle electrification versus, more long-term decongestion efforts, like you mentioned, like bikeability. And it's really not an easy either or, it should be a both and. And so in California, we need more sustainable funding sources to ensure programs see consistent funding.
Thank you for that, Maurissa. Yes, definitely something that we're seeing across not just EV incentive programs, but other state programs that focus on sustainable transportation pilots across the state, and the need for that sustainable funding to exist for those programs to continue to have impact in the communities that need them the most. There's a question here from one of our colleagues here at ITS Davis at the EV Research Center. Is car dependence generally higher or lower for priority populations compared to the mean? Also, do these populations take more or fewer long vehicle trips? I do recall we had a question in the survey with regards to long vehicle trips. Any thoughts on this?
I wouldn't know like what the definition of car dependence is here. I would say people's travel is quite car dependent, but whether or not that is like a choice people have made, or whether it is out of necessity because they don't have access to other modes, I think like that is something we haven't dived into recently, but it's probably a little bit of like some bit of preference, but also a lot of like unavailability of transit and other infrastructure to get around. And then I would say like we do see higher car deficiency in these households, so people not having enough vehicles to make the trips that they want to do. And then we didn't look at long distance trips, but the average when we looked at like the average miles of this sample, it was very similar to the average miles driven in a year of other households. But yeah, we didn't specifically ask about long distance trips.
There is thank you for that, Scott. There's a question here from Elliot. We might need some clarification, but I'll give it a try here. Elliot Popo, I recall several years ago, the state changed a highway policy to measure road network level of service to the average vehicle miles traveled. Do you have data on whether priority populations travel longer distances compared to other communities? I guess similar to previous question from Aaron.
I think my answer would be the same. Like we haven't dived too deep into this like travel behavior portion of the survey yet, and the only thing I can say is like it looks like they travel a similar number of miles on average than other households. I think that's all I could say about that at the moment.
Thank you. Yes. Not sure if this was already answered, but there's a question here from Javon Garcia. Is there a suggestion regarding what percentage of budget appropriations should go to capital investments compared to the educational outreach efforts?
Yeah, I think we spoke about this a little bit. And again, like I didn't have an answer. Like I don't know how I would answer that question without doing some further kind of study, other than to say it should be more than it is now. Like I was trying to account for the amount of public funding that has gone into education and engagement efforts, and it's certainly like a lot lower than other efforts like in infrastructure and incentives and so on.
Any other thoughts from folks on this piece around educational efforts? We've touched on it quite a bit. Okay, this is the last question here in the
JC, I would also just add on to this is it's like education, but then also like workforce development is another huge piece of the conversation too that is really important for Greenlining's advocacy.
Yes, 100%. There's I'm not sure if he's still here, but there's a person who works here in the Sacramento area, does a lot of work around workforce development, making sure that the opportunities to have a connection from folks that are kind of working in that space, but also ensuring that there is jobs and employment opportunities for the people in the community that could continue to make a living out of these future careers. So that's something that's big and in a lot of these research projects. Last question here in the Q&A. I also noticing that underserved communities and low-income groups is not a target. Is that inaccurate? What are the efforts being done? Are there grants for EVs or even electric bikes? Per the survey, many we can't apply or have a credit. This is a question from Virginia. There's a few typos in there, so maybe we need some clarification, but if you want to give it a go.
I think the question is, I think the answer is, yeah, like low-income communities are the target of a lot of programs, including e-bike programs in the state. They have carve-outs for disadvantaged communities, and they also have like income eligibility criteria. I think what we were talking about was some programs, and that's California. I don't know about every other state. That would be hard to look at. At least I think California is doing a pretty good job now of directing funding towards who need it most. I think the point was that we were trying to make earlier was just there needs to be a little bit more optimization in those designs, so we can be more confident that it is reaching the people that it is designed to reach. And I don't know about other states, but I mean, I think it's reasonable that people should be considering these elsewhere.
Thank you for that, Scott. This is sort of a closeout question for us here, and this is to the group. Um, you know, if by the next 15, 20 years, 2040, 2045, we reach 100% adoption of ZEVs, what policy intervention do we look back and point to as a key and critical to large-scale adoption of EVs, specifically within priority populations across the state? So this is a question for the group.
Yeah, I can start us off here on this question. I would say number one, targeted funding. So there was a UCLA Luskin report that just came out, and it showed that since 2010, clean vehicle incentives totaling close to $2 billion have been distributed to California drivers through 6 various state programs. However, only 15% of those funds have been delivered to households in disadvantaged communities. So in light of all of the budget deficits, we really need to focus on targeted funding if we want to increase access. And also what's been mentioned that I brought up and that Scott brought up is a sustainable source of funding.
I'll go. I think mandates for sales of EVs is going to be critical. And also another thing to go along with that is complementary policies for sources of electricity, because I think one reason among many that California's and other Section 177 states have had success with EVs is that they provide so much more benefits compared to gas cars, but that's obviously not the case for other places. So I think making EVs more attractive that way through a cleaner grid. And then lastly, I think unfortunately for when it comes to engagement, I don't necessarily think there is a silver bullet, and I think that's sort of the key is that it takes a lot of different points of contact over a lot of different avenues. So yeah, I guess I don't know if there would be a comprehensive engagement policy that we could look back on unless there was sort of like an unprecedented sort of funneling of funds toward engagement. But yeah, I would say that.
Yeah, I 100% agree with both with all those ideas from Maurissa and Kelly. And I guess not to duplicate anything that I said. I think anything we do around getting as many people access to charging from home, or wherever they park their car while they're at home, or work, or wherever they school, someplace they go regularly. I think there's a lot of questions about how public infrastructure influences people's decisions and how the impact that might have or may not have. Whereas I think it's relatively clear how important home charging is. And so I think anything we can do around that we will look back on, and I do not think we will have any regrets.
Thank you all for your remarks. For the research team, this is still an ongoing project with some analysis, but I'm wondering at this point, are there new questions or areas of the research that this study has elevated and inspired for future exploration down the line?
Maybe I'll just go back to the education thing. I would love to design a study where we can test what effects different types of information and where that information would come from would have on people, so that we can make more concrete recommendations on what kind of education awareness and engagement campaigns would look like. I would love to be able to do a study around that.
Thank you, Scott. Kelly, any areas of interest that this study has highlighted?
Yeah, I think sort of relatedly, just how to make investments in public charging more impactful, especially in these communities, and also taking into account their preferences for the locations of public charging that they would prefer. I think sort of a lot of the fast charging that's been emphasized gets used by people who don't live in those communities necessarily. So I think further exploring their preferences for charging and yeah, how to make that more effective.
Thank you, Kelly. Thank you to everybody that has stayed on through these 90 minutes. We are getting close here to time. I want to take a moment to thank our participants. Also want to thank our speakers, Maurissa, Scott, Kelly. So thank you all for being here today. I see the clapping hands going. One final thing that I want to share is I want to pull up this share screen here for folks to, if you're interested in staying up to date with what's going on at ITS Davis with all of our research, you can join our ITS email list by scanning this QR code here. And also want to let folks know that this is a summer EV policy series that we intend to do a few more of these. And the next one we anticipate will be later in July, Tuesday, July 30th. We are hoping to dive into the public charging infrastructure network. There's a lot of issues and challenges and concerns with the current state of the public infrastructure ecosystem, and we are teeing up a couple of our postdoctoral researchers here at the EV Research Center, Dr. Aaron Rabinowitz, who is active in the chat today, and Dr. Vaishnavi Karanam, who is also postdoctoral research here at the EV Research Center. Some of the topics that we intend to discuss in that upcoming webinar is the experience that people are having when utilizing the public infrastructure system and network, and also some of the structural factors and operational factors that impact performance of that public infrastructure ecosystem. With that, I want to give one last round of applause to our speakers and participants. Thank you all. And like I said, if you want to stay up to date with our activities and research at ITS Davis, feel free to scan that QR code and be added to our ITS mailing list. Thank you all for participating this morning and hope to see you on the next one.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, JC, as well for hosting.
Thank you. Thank you, Maurissa.
Thank you.